Hello and welcome to another edition of EdChoice Chats. My name is John Kristof. I'm a senior research analyst at EdChoice. Today I am joined by my illustrious colleague, Mike McShane, and we're talking about everybody's absolutely most favorite Thanksgiving topic, a barbecue topic, rules and regulations around private schools. And before you decide to click away, I'll give you a little bit of a sales pitch here. Rules and regulations shape the schools that we have around us. They shape what schools can look like in your state. They shape your ability to start a private school if you want to try taking things into your hands. And so it's really helpful to know what things are going on in your state. It's good to know what's possible by taking a national view. And Mike McShane has led that charge at EdChoice. I won't say he's answered everything because I'm not going to put that pressure on everybody. But Mike, thanks for joining. I hope you're excited to talk about some of the important but minutia details of schools.
In the weeds. You and I are about to spend half an hour in the weeds.
Yes. So If you're into that kind of thing, this is a podcast for you. If you're not into that kind of thing, I promise you, Mike's approach to this and his ability to take the bird's eye view when necessary, but also point out the details when necessary is really helpful. And I promise you're going to learn something here today. So, Mike, we'll start with one of the bird's eye view. The project that we're talking about here today all started with what we kind of internally started calling the school starter checklist that wound up getting released last summer, actually. So let's start there. What drove that project? What was the impetus behind it? What kinds of questions were we trying to answer there?
Yeah, I mean, given the incredible growth that we've seen in school choice programs, so now there's more support than ever for families to send their children to private schools. We're sort of entering a new era of research, or a new sort of set of questions that we need to ask. Because at first it was a lot of stuff around how do we get families the money that they need, because that's the biggest hurdle that they have to get their kids into private school. Well, now as more and more states are doing that, we recognize that while families having enough money was probably the largest hurdle, it was not the only hurdle. There are lots of other things that happen that can prevent people from being able to find the best school for their child. And part of it could be that school doesn't exist yet, that there are rules and regulations and labor markets and all sorts of things that can restrict or open up the supply of great new schools. So this particular effort was looking at regulations. What are the existing regulations for private schools? So if in the state of Florida, as a response to these programs, or frankly, if in the state of California, where you don't even have any of these programs, you want to start a private school, what are the hoops that you have to jump through? What are the forms you have to fill out? What are the things that you're going to be responsible for? And so we created this thing, as you mentioned, called the school starter checklist. Again, thinking about sort of from the perspective of a school leader. Hey, if you're going to start a school, what are all the things you're going to have to comply with? And we published it last summer, and it's basically was really meant to be a kind of research document, in that we went and we looked across, I think, 8 or 9 different areas, explaining to folks what the regulations were in all 50 states in the District of Columbia. Well, after that came out, I think some people started to ask questions about it and said, okay, well, that's like a lot of stuff, and I might be interested in my own state or what's going on there. But especially policymakers or others are like, well, like, who's doing it well? How does my state stack up? Do we need to do stuff? Should we change things? So a thought came out to try and create some sort of classification system. People love rankings. I don't know what it is in like public policy, but
That's so true.
Isn't it right? Like, I know all of the people that are listening to this that are like involved in public policy, like probably have in their email inbox within the last like week, there's some ranking of something, right? Inside education, outside education, people love ranking things. So folks were like, can you do like a 50 state ranking of the private school regulations of states across the country? And to be perfectly honest, I didn't want to do it because I think a lot of times with these rankings, you can develop rubrics, and ultimately like the way states get ranked is as much about how you construct the rubric as how the quality of whatever the state is doing, unless there's really clear, simple stuff like we're going to rank states by their income tax rate. Well, like that's pretty simple, right? Just line up income taxes and whatever. So as a compromise in this project, what I said was, hey, what if instead of trying to develop like some numerical ranking or whatever, what if we use more of like a stoplight system? Right, where we say, okay, let's look at these different areas where we've identified these regulations And let's try and broadly classify them as either green, which is like necessary and appropriate, that these are fine, that if schools are asked to do this, they're not onerous, that they may actually serve a good purpose, so that's great. And then sort of red is obviously like clearly we shouldn't be asking schools to do this, it's onerous, it's unnecessary, etc. And then because of the nature of like not being on the ground in all 50 states, we created this nice kind of yellow in the middle, which is sort of like a proceed with caution, that as we read it, it could be onerous, it might not be onerous. A lot of it could be like, it depends on how you interpret that. If like you interpret it quite vigorously, then that could be a problem for people, or it could be interpreted in a way where it's easy, but because we don't know exactly how that's working, we'll call it yellow. So we took all 50 states, all the different indicators that we did, and we classified all of them as either green, yellow, or red, which can hopefully just sort of visually, you can look, there's tables in the paper that shows sort of how the different states stack up, but I think also gives a sort of broad enough latitude where we're not trying to say, oh, well, you're like 26th versus 26th, but rather gives you sort of like a visual look of how your state's doing.
Yeah, that's a great overview. Let's say somebody is listening to this and they're taking a look at either the big report or the stoplight system that you've talked about. We've got a lot of different categories going on there. Could you maybe give a little bit of an overview or maybe a layman's term explanation for what types of regulations we're talking about? Maybe curriculum maybe is straightforward to a lot of people, although maybe it's not. But where do building codes fit in? Where do health and safety regulations fit in?
For sure. So we classified them across 8 areas. So the first one is like registration, accreditation, approval, and licensure. So that's like, does your school have to be like a registration side would be, does it have to register with the state? Like, do you have to say, hi, Mike, I operate a private school and this is its address, whatever, all the way up to the state having to approve or license or accredit your school. So that was one. The second is pretty straightforward. It's nonprofit requirements. So does your school have to be a nonprofit or can it be for profit? The third was school day and year. So are there regulations on how long your school day has to be or how long your school year has to be? There's curriculum. That's the fourth one, which is, to what level does the state dictate what subject matter you have to cover or how many hours you have to spend or any of that sort of stuff. The fifth is a pretty broad one, but it's around record keeping. So what sort of records do you have to keep and do you have to provide them to the state? There are certain ones you have to provide to the state, others that you don't. The next is testing. So are there any testing requirements from the state? And if there are testing requirements from the state, are there also reporting requirements that go along with it? The seventh and second to last, penultimate, is teacher certification. So do your teachers have to be certified? And then finally, a big broad category is around health and safety. So this gets to sort of what you were talking about, air codes, and other regulations that are related around that. And so I think people probably in their minds can already think about across these 8 different areas that there's a spectrum of more onerous to less onerous and things that are like clearly necessary in some of these areas and things that aren't.
Well, it's tough to talk about all 8 categories, much less the 50 different states, regulations in those 8 different categories. But would you be able to describe any maybe general trends or impressions that you had as you were kind of sifting through this and trying to lead the charge in creating this stoplight system? Are things pretty bad out there? Are things maybe not so bad? Some surprising states, some not so surprising states. What stood out to you?
So the thing that always stands out to me whenever I do this sort of stuff is there's that old saying that no raindrop thinks it's responsible for the flood, right? So when I look at these regulations, and I think most people, when they do, whether you either go to the sort of source document of the school starter checklist or this document that sort of uses that to rank these various things, almost all these regulations that you look at in isolation make total sense. That they're perfectly reasonable. And in fact, in many cases, they sort of are related to things that we're really afraid about, right? So things like fire safety or, disease control or teacher background checks or any of that sort of stuff, like really trying to prevent horrific, scary things. But when you see across states and you realize that like some states do these and some states don't, you start to get that idea of like, oh, so a classic one that I'll give you is lots of states in their health and safety regulations have eye protection requirements. So it's like if you're working in a science lab or whatever, you have to wear eye protection. Again, as you or I hear this or anyone who's listening, it's probably like perfectly reasonable that we want people to do that. But not every state has that. In fact, like I believe the majority of states do not. And as far as I know, children are not being blinded in all of these places because it's already a common enough practice that you don't actually have to have a regulation for it. And again, there's like a broader conversation to have here, which is like, what do these regulations actually do? Does it actually require that kids would wear that? Or does it require that you like file a form with the state that in your, lab manual, there's a requirement for it, which is not the same thing as necessarily having that happen. But those are the sorts of things that stand out to me is regulations that might look reasonable, but then you see like only one state has it and 49 others don't. And you're like, oh, well, then you probably don't need to have this. Like, it's already a common enough practice. There's things around like the number of fire drills or tornado drills or things like that. Like, again, at first glance, some people saying, oh, you need to have like a monthly fire drill. You're like, well, we don't want kids to perish in a fire, so let's do that. But then you realize like most states don't require that. Most will have like one a year or two a year. And you're like, oh, that's probably enough. And that's, again, lost instructional time and all sorts of organizational things that go along with it. So these things are like big and small, and obviously much more onerous things that come up around like teacher certification. Teacher certification sounds like a good idea. Well, it turns out most states don't require it. And again, it's probably fine. So those are the sort of trends that I looked at, was like, how can something that, again, seems reasonable, seems important in one state not exist in 40 others and everything's still okay?
I think you point out a lot of, I think, really important things there. One being, enforcement is always half the side of a law, and it is kind of, that's a big unanswered question in everything that we're doing here, but it's something worth keeping in mind. And then the other thing, with your very, very apt metaphor about the rainfall, the challenge is maybe not looking at one specific regulation, but you go to your state and you're like, oh, this keeps going. Like this list keeps on going. You've talked to a lot of people who are running micro schools or trying to get into hybrids, do this hybrid homeschooling thing. So you've talked to a lot of people who have had to deal with regulations and are asking the types of questions that we're trying to answer in this report. What would you tell them to look out for if somebody's new or maybe they're a year into this? What would you tell them to look out for when they open up this document?
Yeah, I think obviously you'd want to go to your state and see the issues that are there. The one thing that I would actually tell them to look out for is what's not in this report. This is a report about state level regulations. And frankly, a lot of the stuff like you had mentioned earlier about fire codes and others, a fair number of those actually exist at the local level. So that's your local municipality, could be your city or your county. So folks would definitely want to get in contact with those people as well. I know a fair few of the micro school leaders and other people that I've talked with are actually like the people in the state love them and they think they're great or whatever. The person that's giving them headaches is at their local sort of zoning person. So that's definitely something that I would look at. But I think a big thing would be like the big ticket items of like your school's like registration, accreditation, et cetera. Like, does your state require those things? Almost every state requires schools to at least be registered, which for those of you listening at home, we gave that a green, right? Like having to send your name and address to the state to open a private school. We don't think is either onerous or unnecessary. But then, it ramps up from there, right? That a fair number of states, like you actually have to be approved by the state to operate. That's like your first port of call. Like if you're going to operate as a private school and your state requires accreditation, there's a lot of work that's going to go into that and you're going to have to look into that. I think teacher certification is another one too. Like folks should be looking, who are you hiring? And does your state require certification? And if it does, like you probably have to find someone who's been certified as a teacher to work there. There's obviously a lot of advocacy work and others where people, if they want to change it, they should. But those are two big ticket first items that I'd look to.
Moving on to the stoplight grading system, as we've kind of colloquially called it here. Would you expound maybe a little bit on the process of determining these grades? And you can go into as much detail or not as much detail as you want, but I am certain that anybody who opens up that document is going to find something and then see the law that we're talking about and be like, that's really harsh or that's not harsh enough of a grade.
Yes.
Would you like to expound upon how we have how
Yes, thank you. I appreciate the question because I remember in elementary school or even later, like in college, if you were working in a group And even now we go to conferences and sometimes they do this. You're in a group and someone's like, okay, you need to choose the recorder and the report, like someone's going to write it down and someone needs to be the reporter to like put it out. I was just the recorder. I know I'm now on this podcast as like the face of this thing, and that's fine. I was the guy who put pen to paper, but the way we came up with this system was a sort of democratic one within EdChoice. We put a bunch of our teams together, actually across, not just on our research team, but other people who work in this space and who are thoughtful people about this. And we got on a bunch of Zoom calls and hashed these things out. We had these areas. I sort of pitched the stoplight idea. And then I think maybe I sent some like preliminary things of like, here could be a way we'd classify as red, yellow, as green, yellow, and red. And then we argued with one another about it. Some of them for like a really long time. So there's probably people, yes, who are reading this. If they're like, you think that's too harsh, there's probably someone at EdChoice who absolutely agrees with you on that one. But this was a team effort on it. And look, and this is also why I think you'll see a lot of things that fall in that yellow area. Because again, we just have a certain disadvantage. We're a national level organization. We are looking at the text on the page. And I know, because this has happened to me before, you'll bring it up to someone who lives in whatever, Kansas or things. And you point to a regulation, you're like, oh my goodness, look how onerous this is. How are schools able to operate? And then you talk to someone who's there and they're like, people don't really enforce it, or people have taken a very liberal interpretation of what it means. And then somewhere else, they'll say, like something we'll say, oh, this doesn't look bad at all. They're like, oh, but they enforce it so vigorously that it's actually super difficult. So look, people who are doing this every single day may look at these various things and be frustrated. And I appreciate that. And even with the school starter checklist, because we had so many states and so many things, I was like, please email me. I know I got some of these wrong when we were putting this stuff together, because we were searching through codes and regs across, different areas, even within the same state. We were lucky. We did, I think, better than I initially anticipated. We only had a few people send us various errata. But yeah, so the same thing. So I apologize if you read this and you disagree with our reading. Like I said, I may agree with you. I may be on your side and just got outvoted. But that was the process that we went through.
Yeah, local knowledge and experiential knowledge is probably always going to be more valuable with these types of things than our high level view. But hopefully this helps start a conversation, get people moving in the right direction when they're trying to start a school or just trying to get a sense of what things look like interstates. But yeah, I think we're still free to I think we're still interested in people's feedback if anybody listening to this has any. Lastly, just to really kind of single things out, there must be thousands of regulations that we have talked about. Are there any in particular that stand out to you as just like funny? I've always had like a couple laws in my head, not necessarily about education, but I'm like, that's a really funny, ridiculous law. I wonder how that came out to be. Were there any that stood out to you?
Yes, I have a few favorites. So, and again, some of these, like, I don't know. I just have fun with life more than I think a lot of people do. So some of these, like, I get maybe we graded them as like red or something, but I think they're funny and I enjoyed them. So I'm not trying to be dour. That's probably the word I'm looking for. I don't look at regulations in a dour way. So here's some fun ones. Texas. God bless Texas. I'm reading this here. Parochial and private schools are expected to observe Texas Week the week of March 2nd. That was a fun one.
I don't know why that one hasn't made it national.
I know, right? Another one that's sort of in Vermont, a similar one, independent schools must annually conduct exercises in the commemoration of the birth, life, and services of Abraham Lincoln on the last school day before February 12th. So I guess before President's Day or whatever. And again, it's like one of those things where I'm like, I love Abraham Lincoln. He was great. I love Texas. If I was in Texas, I'd want people to do it. But maybe something else is going on in school that day, so you need to do something else. The one more that I'll give that this one is slightly more serious. I think it's ridiculous, but it points to a serious point. And it is from the great state of South Dakota. And I'll read it here. This is around the school day or school year, right? And it is the number of hours in the school term for kindergarten may be no less than 437.5 hours. For grades 1 through 5, may be no less than 875 hours. And for grades 6 through 12, may not be less than 962.5 hours exclusive of intermissions, which is when pupils are at research or at lunch. So this is like the most probably exacting example we have of states requiring. So like a lot of states require you have to be in for 180 days or 183 days. A lot of states require you have to be in the same number of days as public schools. But this is one where it's like literally the number of instructional hours. And it sort of points to this thing of like 437.5 hours. Well, it's like, why not 438 or 437 or 436 or 442? It gives this illusion of specificity that it's like, that is what children need. And you're like, what? Why do they need? How can you be so sure that like that is the minimum number that they need down to the 30 minutes? And again, it opens all sorts of questions like, well, what about like the last week of school when everyone's sitting around watching movies, right? Or whatever, or Texas week, or, it's South Dakota, but whenever you're doing those sorts of things. So those, like, it makes me, that level of specificity makes me laugh. It's like, I don't know if you ever listened to Russ Roberts' podcast, Econ Talk.
Oh, yeah.
But he gets a certain joy out of like really fine point estimates of like things of like how many 912 hours and 15 seconds. And it's just like that level of specificity is like impossible to actually know. And it's the same sort of thing with that, which is like, it just strikes me as kind of ridiculous.
I think it's from SNL, an election cycle ago. The numbers get big enough, they're all fake anyway.
Yeah, right?
Yes.
Agreed.
If you really care about the children, we'd give them an extra half hour of instructional time. Yeah, that's a good, I think, humorous and also philosophical point to end on with what we expect out of
So I try to be, John. I
regulations.
try to be humorous and philosophical.
A really well-rounded individual. It's what we appreciate about you. And we appreciate everyone tuning into this. I know you learned something. Feel free to tell us on our socials or comments or however you find your podcast about something that you learned from this podcast today. Check out both reports at your leisure, the school starter checklist and our stoplight system that is coming out at some point soon. I don't know when this is releasing, but when it does release, it means that the report is out. So
fantastic.
Go check that out because they're coming out in pairs. So thank you to our listeners in the future for checking out this podcast. We'll be back again soon to talk about more research that we're doing on the RTL team. But until then, thanks to Mike McShane for joining me and nerding out over some rules and regulations. And we will see you next time on EdChoice Chats.